BYU has done a pretty good job of not letting other teams beat them with explosive plays. Kansas, of course, here lately has been very explosive. And when you look at the way they've been able to get over the top in the passing game, the way that that's opened up other things, I really think that could be a key in this one too.
Thanks for listening to KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank. If you're thinking about starting a business or know someone who is, check out Emprise Bank's SBA loans. It's always good to know your options, and they can be your partner in possible. Paid all who enter. Beware of this podcast. That's right, this is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer, as always, here with Kevin Flaherty. We're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible. Member FDIC. Today we're going to be breaking down all things KU and BYU on the gridiron. Kansas is headed to Provo. It's a late kick, 9:15 p.m. Central Time. It's going to be one you're going to need to stay up for late, get a mid-afternoon nap in on Saturday, maybe drink a cup of coffee. I don't drink coffee, though, so, but if you are somebody that does, you might want to partake in that because it's going to be another late night for KU against BYU. And, of course, BYU, Kevin, is undefeated, and they are on the precipice of honestly, I think they're pretty close to, if they, win, they'd be pretty close to just locking themselves into the Big 12 title game. They're pretty close to that. When you look at how the rest of the conference is shaking out right now, Iowa State's got 2 losses. Colorado is still there. Kansas State, obviously. But BYU is very much in the driver's seat at this point in time with that 9-0 record. And here comes big bad Kansas, 3-6, but coming off a big win against Iowa State. Obviously played pretty well against K-State. Maybe could have won in Manhattan before that. What are your initial impressions of Kansas heading to Provo to take on BYU?
Yeah, as crazy as it sounds for an undefeated team playing a 3-6 team, best 3-6 team in the country, Nick Springer. But as crazy as it sounds for that, I actually kind of like this matchup for Kansas. And if you remember, I said the same thing heading into the Iowa State game last week. I think that BYU is a really interesting team. And what I mean by that is they're undefeated. I've talked on this show about how with Bill Snyder, a lot of times I'll say that he's the king of winning games when the other team walked off the field feeling like they were the better team. That's been BYU this year and Kalani Sitake. And there's a compliment in there. It may not seem like it, but there is, because BYU hasn't always played its best football. When you look at the stats and the way that they've matched up over the course of conference season, Nick, they haven't really jumped out in a lot of categories, but they found ways to win because they're winning the margins that a lot of other teams are losing on. And obviously, part of that is turnovers. They've forced 16 turnovers over 6 games, lead the Big 12 in interceptions. The other thing is special teams. They've gotten some huge special teams plays when they've needed them. They've had 2 special teams touchdowns, 1 punt return, 1 kick return. And so, Nick, when you look at it from that standpoint, defensively, BYU allows you to move the ball. They don't necessarily let you get into the end zone. Offensively, BYU's more opportunistic, I would say, than successful or high-powered. But ultimately, all of that has come into this cocktail that has the Cougars undefeated and looking at a potential spot, not just in the Big 12 title game, but potentially even into the college football playoff.
Yeah, I mean, look, just to accentuate your point, Kansas is 3-6, like we highlighted. I don't think I've ever seen an undefeated top 10 team. BYU is 6th right now. An undefeated top 10 team this late in the season playing against a 3-6 team at home, and BYU was only 2.5 to 3-point favorites.
Yep.
Basically indicating, if you're unfamiliar with kind of how Vegas works, essentially Vegas is saying that if that game were played on a neutral site, it would be dead even. Normally, it's about 3 points for home versus away. So they're essentially saying that Kansas and BYU are dead even, and yet one team is undefeated, 9-0 on the cusp of the Big 12 title game and maybe beyond, and another team is 3-6, and at this point just fighting to win out to have a shot at a bowl game. So that kind of illustrates your point, I think, to a T, really, about this BYU team and what they've done. And when you roll through their schedule, they've had plenty of close calls over the course of their schedule in conference play. You look at that 38-9 win over Kansas State. I know a lot of K-State fans are really upset about that one, saying it was a fluky game. K-State moved the ball on them pretty well. I think K-State they had the ball with the lead towards the end of the first half, and Avery Johnson throws an interception, and the whole thing kind of fell apart for them. They end up losing that one, or K-State ends up losing. BYU ends up winning that one. The BYU has a tight game against Baylor on the road, only winning by 6. They nearly lose to Oklahoma State at home back in early October, back in the middle of October.
Oklahoma State, of course, still winless in the Big 12.
Yep. And then obviously this most recent game for BYU against Utah, which depending on who you ask, may or may not have been stolen. I just want to reiterate, Brett Yormark, that I personally am not saying that it was stolen, so please do not fine me $40,000 because I'm not saying that it was stolen. I'm just saying that other people may or may not have said that. So please don't fine me $40,000 because
I'll put myself out there for the Utah fans, the 3 that might be watching the show. It was the right call. He held the receiver. He tugged the jersey, causing him to lose balance. It was the right call.
Allegedly, it was the right call. I want to make that clear. Allegedly, it was the right call. But yeah, you get that. So obviously, BYU hangs on against Utah and wins that one. Ends up winning that game in a very, very tight battle in a big time rivalry game. And that kind of leads me to this point, Kevin, of BYU coming off that win against Utah. I don't know if there's any potential for a letdown because, as interesting as it may seem, I don't think anybody is overlooking Kansas. Kansas, even though they're 3-6, like you go back, you listen to some of the pregame press conferences from Arizona State with Kenny Dillingham. At the time, KU I think was 1-3, 1-4. Kenny Dillingham was like, "Hey, we're not overlooking these guys." Like every coach says that KU is one of the best teams they're going to play, despite KU's record. So I don't know if this is a potential letdown spot for BYU after the rivalry win, but at the same time, I think they're probably going to have BYU will probably have their full attention on Kansas, but it is an interesting food for thought.
Yeah, and I think Kalani Sitake's a heck of a coach and the type of guy that gets his team focused every week. You hear the term coach's coach tossed around a lot. Your favorite coach, probably Kalani Sitake, is one of his favorite coaches. Coaches almost unanimously love that guy for multiple reasons. I think he's a great guy, but I also think, he is very much a football coach's football coach. And I think when you look at Kansas moving into this game, it's interesting because I think of the way that last year's game went. And I wonder if that's going to be on the mind of some of those players as well. Maybe it's not, but BYU came into that game, I think, feeling like they could probably push Kansas around. If you remember, Kobe Bryant had just a massive hit that led to a scoop and score, and Kansas was the more physical team in that game. And I think that when BYU goes back and looks at that, or when they think about that, that's the sort of thing that a lot of times can lead to some carryover as well, just sort of saying, hey, these guys pushed us around a little bit a year ago. I thought it was really interesting. Jeff Grimes and Brian Borland, we got a chance to talk to them today. And one of the things that they mentioned was that BYU has taken on more of a physical mentality this year. The fact that they are, I think Brian Borland said they're less finesse-based this year. They have a very apparent mentality where we will not be out tough. We're going to shove you around. And so just, against that prism maybe a little bit, I think that this would be a game that BYU would be up for it in sort of we're not going to let Kansas be the more physical team in this contest, if nothing else, because of the way last year's game went.
Yeah, and you think about last year's game, too. BYU kind of abandoned the run last year.
Yep.
They ended up throwing the ball with Keaton Slovis a bunch. And Kansas took advantage with a pick six, remember, to start the second half as well. That helped them win that game also. So when you look at this BYU team, Kevin, I'm curious what your perspective is on this. The first thought that I think comes to mind for some people, myself included, is this BYU team just a 2021 TCU? Meaning, like, not that great, but getting lucky and winning, or I don't want to say lucky, but getting, the beneficiary of winning some very, very close games, some one-score games. And if so, what does that mean for Kansas potentially if they want to try to win this game?
Yeah, we've talked about 2022 TCU.
2022 TCU, sorry.
A few times on this show in terms of that year. TCU won so many close games in the regular season that it basically propelled them to the college football playoff. Iowa State that year finished last in the Big 12, had a similar number of close games, and lost just about all of them. And that was the reason that those teams had such divergent seasons. If Iowa State had won all their close games the way that TCU did up until the Big 12 title game, and TCU had lost all, they would have had a similar season as Iowa State. That really was the gap there. And I think that when you look at this BYU team, it's easy to make that comparison. I'm not sure they're as dynamic as that TCU team was. I do think it's easy to find some comparisons, though, because I don't know that Jake Retzlaff is a Heisman Trophy candidate at quarterback, but I do think that he's an experienced guy that has toughness to him that can hurt you with his legs in a similar way to what you saw with TCU. And so I do think there's maybe a little bit of that as well. It's interesting because they are having so many close games, though. Like you said, not overpowering in a way that a team that wins the league and potentially goes to the college football playoff really is. I think BYU this year is probably better defensively than that TCU team was, but I don't know that they're as dynamic offensively as that TCU team was.
Well, look, I'll just say this. Given Kansas's history of playing one-score games up to this point in the season, like the fact that BYU has proven they can win games and Kansas has proven that they are not really able to fully put away one-score games, that definitely concerns me. You know, this game's on the road at elevation. You're playing against a team that, you know, just has that sense that they're going to find a way to win. They've done it all season. And from the Kansas perspective, you're a team that, look, is still, really struggled in one-score games, right? Or really struggled late in games. You even look at the Iowa State game where Iowa State got the ball down 10 with a chance to maybe really go make it a game before KU kind of got that pick six from Mello Dotson. So, that's concerning to me that if this game is close late and on one side you have a sideline that believes that they can win, has proven that they can win every close game that they've been in this season, and on the other sideline, you have a team that has not been able to close out late in games.
Well, and that's why you wonder if the Mello Dotson interception, even though it technically wasn't a one-score game, the fact that it had gotten nip and tuck there at the end, you wonder if that was the play that KU needed, right, to get over that hump and say, hey, we can make this play in a game that is going the other way, that can reverse the momentum, that can get the other team off the field in a way that we want to. I thought it was really interesting. Like I said, we had Brian Borland today and talked to him a little bit about basically playing with the lead as a defense and kind of where some of those struggles were coming from. And he said, well, it's people are going to make plays, but we want to make it to where it's the other team making plays and not us making a mistake, not us forgetting to cover a guy or not doing our assignment right. And I thought that was kind of telling because I do think that in those situations, Kansas maybe has gotten a little tight and maybe guys haven't been executing at the same level that they have earlier in the game. Like I said, I do think that Mello Dotson interception has a chance to potentially be a catalyst for Kansas moving forward in that. But to your point, if it is a one-score game, and most of us think that it probably will be a one-score game, BYU's playing a lot of them. Kansas is playing a lot of them. Obviously, the spread would indicate that people are expecting a one-score game. BYU at this point in the season, you would think, doesn't just believe it can win, but knows it should win. And Kansas potentially in a spot where you're waiting for the other shoe to drop or something going the other way. And that's why I think that Mello Dotson interception could be an important thing for them moving forward.
I want to dive deeper into some of the numbers with BYU and kind of break down this game a little bit more in depth. We'll do that on the other side of the break. Of course, as always, got to tell you about our friends over at Home Field Apparel. You can shop over 40 plus KU items and more over at homefieldapparel.com. With the weather changing, it's starting a little chillier. They've got you covered with some long sleeve sweaters, joggers to keep you warm when you're lounging around the house watching Kansas. In this case, basically you'll be in your pajamas for this game, essentially, with the late night kick at BYU. But they've got tons of different options for you covered through the end of football season and into the basketball season as well. So you can check out all of that over at homefieldapparel.com. And if you're a first-time shopper, you can use promo code PAYHEAT24 for 15% off your first order. More KU BYU talk coming up next. Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your number one source Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com. This is the paid podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer, here with Kevin Flaherty. If you like what you're listening to or watching, if you're joining us on YouTube, be sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, drop a comment on YouTube at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN to share your thoughts on this game and more. You can also check out some of our previous content. We had a great interview with Coach Ryan Bernardi of Prolific Prep, who is the coach of Darren Peterson, recently signed with Kansas, the highest rated recruits in Kansas basketball history since Josh Jackson. So in about 7-8 years, he's the highest rated recruit. You know, even further back to Andrew Wiggins, he's in that level. So go check that out if on the basketball side as well. But here with football, Kansas heading to Provo to take on BYU. Kevin, I want to dive a little bit deeper into this matchup, especially on the defensive side of the ball with BYU's defense versus KU's offense. And one particular thing that I've been thinking about, and you touched on it, BYU has 16 interceptions as a team this season. They are leading the Big 12 in that stat. Their pass defense is probably the one thing on their, when you look at their stats, that you would say is elite, and a lot of that has to do with their ability to create turnovers. And I really think this is going to be a test for Jalen Daniels in a big way, because early in the year when he was still kind of rusty or whatever the issues were with him and the offense, and he really struggled and he was throwing a lot of interceptions, but he seems to have figured things out over the past couple of games. You think back to the K-State game, he played outstanding, had that one interception late in the first half, but other than that was phenomenal. Played a great game against Iowa State, obviously leading them to a win. But this game, to me, is going to be the ultimate test of where Jalen Daniels is at, because he's going to be facing an aggressive pass defense that can force a lot of turnovers. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest keys for Kansas is what's the level of play Jalen Daniels can produce in this game for KU, because that's going to be the real strength of BYU is that pass defense, especially when it comes to forcing interceptions. So can Jalen Daniels take care of the ball and continue his upward trajectory that he's been on over the past couple of games?
Well, do you know the best way to not throw interceptions, Nick?
Run the ball.
Run the dang ball. And I think that's one of the interesting things about this matchup as well. And we'll talk about the passing game, but BYU's giving up almost 170 rushing yards a game in Big 12 play, 5 yards a carry in Big 12 play. And so I think there's a chance here for Kansas to go out and establish a running game and really put Jalen Daniels into comfortable throwing situations where he's not having to force the ball into windows that he doesn't want to throw them into. I do think, I'm not saying Kansas is going to turtle head in on this one, because I think that the passing game is a big part of why they've had success as an offense overall here lately. You see them stretch the field vertically, and that's not just helped the running game, that's helped open up the intermediate passing game. You're starting to see Jalen connect more on some of those mid-range passes over the middle of the field that they weren't getting earlier this year. And so I do think the running game can be used in this one to protect him a little bit. I think, too, it's a chance for him to have success even without throwing the ball, with him running the ball. And so I think when you look at all of that, Jalen Daniels is a guy that didn't necessarily throw a ton of interceptions heading into this year, right? I think 2022, if I remember right, this is literally off the top of my head, I think he had 4 interceptions all season. And so when you look at that, and that's why the start of this year, I don't want to say was so alarming, but so out of character, Nick, and how you could tell maybe, hey, there's some rust here, some things that need to get knocked off that were a little bit different. Throwing 3 interceptions in one game against Illinois, coming back the next week and throwing 2 more. I think you're absolutely right in that he's, for the most part, really gotten the handle on those. And that's not saying that he hasn't thrown any passes that have been at risk or whatever. If you remember against Iowa State, he threw the pass to Quentin Skinner sort of in the corner of the end zone that probably could have been picked off. And so he's still going to take the odd risk, but at the same time, I do think he's doing a much, much, much better job of protecting the football than he was earlier this season. I think that's a big part of the reason that the offense is finding so much success here in the last few weeks.
Yeah, look, you won't meet a bigger advocate for Jalen running the football than me. I mean, I love it. Quarterback power, speed option, read option, all of it. I love all of it. I think it's great. When anytime Jalen Daniels has the ball in his hands and he's running with it, I think it adds a complete extra level of dynamite to the offense that KU has. And obviously, on top of that, you mentioned the weaknesses in the run game for BYU. Well, of course, Kansas has the all-time leading rusher now, with Devin Neal. And on top of that, Daniel Highshaw got back healthy against Iowa State, which is really big as well, to where KU doesn't feel like they have to just ride Devin Neal for all 60 minutes of a game when they have a guy like Daniel Highshaw that can step in. And
can we get the ball to my man Nick's Savion Morrison? Can we get more carries to that? He had the long touchdown carry against K-State, and it plays well on a couple carries there. Nick would just like to see a few more touches go Savion Morrison's way.
I mean, look, Savion Morrison is the most efficient ball carrier Kansas has, Kevin. I mean, when he gets the ball, he just produces. That's all he does. The problem is he doesn't ever get the ball. But yeah, so I would love to see Savion Morrison, but I understand, obviously, as president of the Savion Morrison fan club, that other people are not members, and you know what? That's okay. But yeah, you'll have Daniel Highshaw, you have Devin Neal.
Did he win the Heisman Trophy in your dynasty with Kansas?
No, he did not. I have a college football 25 dynasty with Kansas. I'm actually in I think I'm in year 9 of that dynasty now. So I've been going for a while.
I thought I remember Morrison having a huge year for you, though.
He did have a huge year. Yeah, he had 25 rushing touchdowns. And he was really good. I don't think he won the Heisman, though. I did win the Heisman with Isaiah Marshall one year, which was good. But
yeah, Dak Brinkley won 2. So
yeah, I'm in year 9, I think. Listen, I've talked with you about this off air, but I play on the hardest difficulty, Heisman difficulty, which makes things very challenging. And I'm honestly not that great at video games either. Is the other issue. And so I'm in year 8 of my KU dynasty, but I hate to say it, I hate to admit it, I have yet to win the national championship. I've gotten to the national title game, I've gotten to the semifinals in multiple seasons, but I actually have not won it. So I am still nose to the grindstone trying to win a national championship with my Kansas Jayhawks in 2035 of NCAA football 25. So, okay, that's a little bit of a tangent about that. We'll set that aside for now. Back to this game here in 2024 with KU and BYU. When you look at the offense of BYU, Kevin, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but they really lack any real significant playmakers that pop out to you when you kind of look at the stat sheet. Jake Retzlaff, he's been doing basically just enough for BYU, right? 18 touchdowns, 7 interceptions this season. He has not been overly impressive, but he hasn't made any big mistakes. The running back by committee, they have their leading rusher is about 425 yards on the ground with LJ Martin. You look at their receivers. Chase Roberts is a big-bodied receiver that could pose a bit of a matchup issue for the KU secondary. And then a name that Kansas fans should be very familiar with is Darius Lassiter, of course, related to the Lassiters of KU. He's at wide receiver as well. Their second leading receiver in both receptions and yards, and has 4 touchdowns as well. But this BYU offense, Kevin, they don't really hurt themselves. Another interesting thing about the BYU offense, though, is they have not been, and this is very interesting for an undefeated team. They have not only been not very good on third downs, they've been kind of bad on third downs. I mean, they're 32% third down rate as an offense this season, and that's not a number you would think would be a team that's undefeated.
Yeah, another interesting thing about him too is you talked about running back by committee. You can almost throw Retzlaff in there because he's had at least 6 carries in every game this season except for one, including he had one game where he had, I think, 81 yards rushing, against Oklahoma State. And so when you look at that part of it, there is some designed quarterback run game in there. They do have a little bit of option in there. But to your point, they haven't been real consistent in terms of converting third downs. And I do think that up front, they're better than they were a year ago. They are a little banged up there coming off of last week's game. But I think that that's an area where, like we talked about last week, that whole movable object meets a stoppable force. Kansas's defense has struggled at times this year, getting people into third down at advantageous positions and then not getting off the field. BYU has gotten into positions and not converted third downs. And so when you look at that matchup, that's something that I'm interested to see, and that can Kansas shorten BYU's drives, where you aren't asking the defense to be on the field at altitude for 10 plays. If you can get them off the field early on a drive on third down, that could pay dividends down the road in this game. And I think that when you watch that Arizona State game, it wasn't at altitude, but the level of heat, the fact that KU was lacking depth because of some injuries in that game, you really saw KU's defense wear down over the course of that game. And I think while there aren't a whole lot of headliners on defense that you would just say, hey, this guy is out right now, I do think Kansas's defense has some guys that are pretty nicked up here and there. And so finding a way, hey, the first couple plays have happened, BYU's in 3rd and 6, getting off the field in that situation, Nick, could be absolutely huge for the defense, not just for that single drive, but over the course of the game as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on the flip side for the offense, you look at some of the wins that BYU has had, it's been because teams haven't been able to punch it into the end zone for touchdowns against them, right? They're like, you mentioned it, they give up yards, but they either get turnovers or they've been pretty good in the red zone. So on the offensive side for Kansas, you've got to be able to capitalize off that. If you have decent field position, go down and don't get 3, but get 7 against these guys.
Yeah, you have to take advantage of your opportunities because BYU is going to. It's kind of like playing Kansas State in that regard.
I didn't want to say that, but that's kind of where the line was going.
Where when you head in to play Kansas State, you have to know, and we talked about this the week of the game, Kansas State is typically not going to beat itself. You have to beat Kansas State. Ironically enough, Nick, though, the one game where Kansas State really beat itself this year, BYU. Yeah. BYU.
By the way, that was a 9:15 game also. So that's
weird things happen, late kicks at altitude. And I thought something that's not necessarily fitting into our discussion, but kind of is, that was interesting was Jeremy Robinson said today that the players had been taking pills basically to help with the altitude here for a couple weeks preparing for this game. And so I'm interested to see how that fared. They said that they didn't really remember doing something similar against Nevada last year, which was another late kick at altitude. And if you remember that game, Nick, that was
fun.
That was not a pretty football game.
No.
That was an ugly contest. Kansas kind of felt like it sleepwalked through portions of that one, was able to come up with a win. You can't sleepwalk through this one. You have to come out and, like I said, find a way to not beat yourself and then find a way to go win the game because BYU is not going to give you the game.
Yeah, that Nevada game last year, you mentioned it. It was not pleasant. It was not enjoyable. At first I was mad I couldn't watch it in time because I had to watch Jacob Porchilla miss field goals for Vanderbilt against UNLV. And then I was mad that they did turn on the KU game because I was like, this is just not fun. This sucks. So it was kind of a double whammy that night. So hopefully things go a little bit better for KU this time against BYU. But yeah, man, I think, you kind of hit the nail on the head. I didn't want to come out outright say it, but BYU team does kind of remind me of playing against a Kansas State, and essentially meaning like they're probably not going to beat themselves. Are they really explosive? Are they really dynamic? No, not really, but they're just going to play hard physical football. And if you make mistakes, they're probably going to punish you for it. And you have to be very, very smart in that area. And one other thing, Kevin, that hasn't really come to bite KU recently, but just having flashbacks to the earlier in the year, is special teams, right? You mentioned it earlier. BYU's been pretty effective especially with punt and kick returns. They had a punt return touchdown, I think against K-State actually, right? Was that punt return touchdown against K-State earlier in the year. Obviously, Kansas gave them a big punt return touchdown against TCU at one point earlier in the season. So special teams will also be something to watch. Of course, Tabor Allen missed a short field goal as well against Iowa State. That's something to consider also. So special teams could also be something to really, really pay attention to in this type of game.
Yeah, and to our point about playing against Kansas State, with how the special teams errors often seem to go when Kansas plays Kansas State, I just think this is a game, Nick, that you can't necessarily go into it being afraid to make a mistake, but at the same time, you need to play clean football because even leaving turnovers out of the equation, if you take a holding penalty, you're probably not getting those 10 yards back. BYU's defense is good enough that it's not going to be easy to convert that. If you give your team bad field position because you make a bad decision on special teams or even something as small as, hey, we're not going to field this punt and it rolls inside the 3. Well, okay, that's going to be really, really tough to go 97 yards the length of the field and punch into the end zone. And so it really is about limiting your mistakes. But the other thing that I think is going to be big in this one, Nick, is BYU has done a pretty good job of not letting other teams beat them with explosive plays. Kansas, of course, here lately has been very explosive. And when you look at the way they've been able to get over the top in the passing game, the way that that's opened up other things, I really think that could be a key in this one too. And can Kansas, you think about the start against Iowa State, right? Iowa State goes 93 yards in or whatever it was in 7 plays.
Yeah.
You're thinking, oh my gosh, this is awful. And then on the second play, Jalen Daniels hits Luke Grimm for a 70-yard touchdown, and it swung the game. Kansas may need to get a couple of those types of plays in this one that take that other stuff out of play. You know, fewer plays in a drive where you could make a mistake, eating up a big chunk of yardage where you're not having to go against BYU's defense for as many plays on that drive. I think explosives could be another big key in this one because we talked about BYU's rushing defense not being that great, but if you're going down the field 5 yards at a time, that's also a lot of plays that you have to execute in a row to get the ball into the end zone.
Well, look, I have no doubt that Jeff Grimes is going to look to take a deep shot probably pretty early in the game. That's sort of been becoming a trend of his, that he likes to see if he can take a deep shot early in games. Obviously, it worked out for KU against Iowa State with that deep ball to Luke Grimm. So, yeah, I actually do think that there's probably, early in the game, I would expect Kansas to maybe look to take something deep to try to take the top off of the defense at BYU, and we'll see if it works out, right? Because if BYU gets the sense that KU is just going to try to ground and pound and start to stack the box, that could lead to some issues. Obviously, their run defense, as you said, statistically is not very good, but I think KU still will definitely want to try to maintain that balance as well.
Yeah, and I think that there's something to be said. You can't take everything away, right? And I think that when you look at BYU's numbers, one of the things that they maybe, I don't want to say allow you to do, but they're more focused on you not getting them in the passing game in a major way, right? You can get that 5 yards on a run, great. Get that next 5 yards, you got a first down, okay. Maybe the next play it's 3, the next play it's 4, and you're in third down situation. And so you have to execute over and over and over again. It very much is a bend but don't break defense. And unlike defenses that coaches say, hey, our defense is bend but don't break, this one actually doesn't break that often. And so when you look at it from that perspective, you're going to have Kansas trying to get a shot play downfield. You're going to have a defense that, one, doesn't typically allow a whole lot of shot plays, but also, Nick, is pretty good at taking the ball away if you think you have a shot there and you don't. And so I do think that there's going to be a little bit of that cat and mouse game there because Kansas does want to generate those explosives in the passing game. BYU is not the easiest defense in the world to do it against.
All right, Kevin, enough BS. It's time to put our money where our mouth is. What are you picking for this game? KU at BYU. Mentioned it earlier. Betting line is anywhere between 2.5 and 3 points for BYU. It's a late night kick. Altitude. What's going to happen in this game? Can Kansas continue their march towards a potential bowl game?
Well, see, looking at last week's predictions, I don't know if I deserve credit for picking KU to beat Iowa State or deserve no credit for having KU score 24 or 27 points, which they had topped by halftime. So it's kind of funny in this one, Nick. I think weird things happen in altitude in late-night games. I do think, though, that this is a matchup that maybe even favors Kansas a little bit. I think a lot of the areas where maybe BYU isn't quite as strong are areas where Kansas is strong. I think BYU 3 weeks ago, when Kansas was maybe turning the ball over a little more, let's say 5 weeks ago, that would be an area that I would be more worried about than I am heading in this one. And that doesn't mean Kansas won't turn it over, but I don't feel like it's as much of an issue as it would have been a few weeks ago. And so I like Kansas's chances to make it 2 in a row over ranked teams in this one. I think the Jayhawks win. I do think it's probably going to be a one-score game, probably somewhere around the scoreline of what I predicted last week, with Kansas finding a way to win, say, 27-24, 28-24, somewhere around in there. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, to kind of add on to your thought process there, as crazy as it sounds, KU, I think, is the better team. Like they've got the better quarterback, they've got the better running back, they've got the better skill position players on offense, they've got the more explosive defensive players, I think, in the secondary and up front. Like I think KU is the better team, right? Now, the issue with that is that you look back at some of the losses KU's had this season, and they've been the better team in a number of those games that they've lost. And so that kind of then feeds into the narrative of it's a late night game. BYU obviously is undefeated. They're going to have a great atmosphere. So I don't know. I'm on the fence about this one. I think, like I said, I think KU's the better team, but it's hard for me to sit here and pick KU to win a one-score game when I don't think they have still fully proven to me that that's something that they're going to be able to do consistently, right? Like the Iowa State game, it didn't ever become a one-score game, and even still, people were, you felt that nervous energy at Arrowhead Stadium when it was just a 10-point game, right? So, like, I'm just not fully confident in Kansas to find a way to win this type of game because, to be quite honest, they have found ways to lose these types of games more often than not this season. So I do think it'll be a lower scoring game. That's maybe a bit something that may surprise people, but I think it's going to be a bit of a lower scoring game. I'm just going to go with BYU. I think KU can win it, obviously, because I think they're the better team. I'm going to go with BYU, though, 23-17. I think BYU wins over Kansas.
I think it'll be fascinating. And to your point, I think if we went by success rate, if you look at stats of wars, every single week where it's, did we really get beat that bad? And it's really just a look at success rate. Kansas could be 7-2. I think the TCU game and then one of the other losses, maybe West Virginia, I think the other team had a better success rate. And so Kansas was play-by-play better in all those other games. Kansas is 3-6. And so obviously that being the better team and even the more consistent better team as success rate measures has not necessarily meant a win for the Jayhawks. I think it's going to in this case, but I certainly understand where you're coming from in terms of, hey, one of these two teams has proven that it wins these games. The other one still has yet to prove that it can win those sorts of games. And so I understand where you're coming from, even if I do think the Jayhawks are going to pull it out.
Yeah, and obviously, certainly I hope that Kansas can pull it out because it would be a monstrous win, obviously beating the number one team in the Big 12, giving them the first loss, and furthering their march towards a potential bowl game as well. And I think I talked about this last week, but also KU is in the midst of playing the top 4 teams in the conference consecutively, back to back to back to back. Obviously, they played well enough to beat K-State in Manhattan, did not win. They definitely played well enough to beat Iowa State because they did win. Now they've got BYU, and then they get Colorado as well. So on the one hand, I think it's exciting that Kansas has been able to sort of rally and put themselves in this position to maybe still fight for a bowl game. On the other hand, Kevin, man, if they end up going 3-1 in these 4 games against the top 4 teams in the conference, and that one loss being against a K-State team that they outplayed and should have won on the road, it's going to leave a bitter taste in my mouth knowing that this Kansas team certainly had the potential to reach the heights that we hoped they could have reached earlier in the season. They just didn't hit their stride quick enough, basically, to achieve that goal. But we'll see what happens on Saturday night in Provo. One other thing I do want to say, Kevin, and this is just sort of an anecdotal thing.
All right.
Is I am mad. And here's why I'm mad. BYU fans are just the greatest people ever. They're so nice. And it's like, BYU's undefeated, and I should be like, I want to knock off that undefeated team. I want to take these clowns out. I want to beat them up. And their BYU fans are just too nice, man. Like I can't even get myself like angry about it. Like Colorado will be easy, right? Like Colorado it'll be easy to do that. K-State was easy. Iowa State's easy. BYU fans they're just too nice, man. They're just nice. Like and then they're like, oh, I just hope both teams have fun. And then all of a sudden I find myself being like, oh, you know what? I just hope both teams have fun. It's okay. Whatever the outcome is, it's fine.
It's funny. The BYU game a year ago, I mean, the fans couldn't have been nicer, the BYU fans who made the trip. And then I actually wound up this summer going on a cruise, like an Alaskan cruise up, by Alaska and Canada. And on the cruise ship one day, they were doing karaoke down in one of the ballroom areas. And I wound up sitting next to a BYU fan. And we had a nice little chat, and just the friendliest guy ever. To your point, was just kind of like, man, we're really enjoying being in the Big 12. Great fan bases. We enjoyed these trips, and I'm just like, gosh, there is absolutely nothing to get mad at this guy for it. And so, just another anecdote to kind of join your anecdote to start. Yeah, the guy that I met on the cruise ship could not have been any nicer about BYU's spot in the Big 12.
Meanwhile, Utah, screw those guys. I mean, they don't even want to be here. They're getting screwed. Yeah, I mean, where you are, Mark, find them more. Find Utah more just for being whiny, little, annoying, what's. So, shout out to BYU for beating Utah. Obviously, I hope Kansas wins, but we'll see what happens in that game coming up on Saturday. And in Provo, Kansas will have, once again, that late kick against BYU. Until then, he's Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer. We'll talk to you again soon. See ya.